Hi, I'm Steve Columbia, and this is the Science for the Extreme Life of the Sea. Today we're going to talk about the shallowest parts of the ocean and the critters that live there. And in fact, some of these places are so shallow that they're not even in the ocean half the time. When the tide goes out, they're on land. When the tide comes in, they're in the ocean. And that imposes a whole set of other requirements on these organisms that they wouldn't have otherwise, and it changes the ecology dramatically. And we'll also talk about when land organisms try to live in the ocean at the margins of the coast, and when ocean organisms try to live up on land and how they do that. If we sort of think about a place where the tide is going out. You imagine a rocky shore with breakers coming in, covering the rocks. And as the tide drops, the water recedes, and you see some algae living on the rocks. You might see some snails. As the tide goes further and further out, you see more and more life exposed there with the tide at low ebb. That's the intertidal. And it doesn't have to be the rocky shore. It could be a beach where the tide goes out and exposing a big strand of sand. It could be a marsh where the tide goes out exposing the roots of the marsh plants. In all these places along the coasts, you see a big shift from high tide, everything is covered, the marine environment, to low tide when everything is exposed to air and sun and sand and wind. And those differences set up a set of gradients in these places that really control the life that lives there. The organisms that live in the upper part of the intertidal are dominated by the harsh physical conditions that are there. The waves that crash on the shore at high tide can be a harsh physical condition. But when the water goes away, desiccation sets in. Basically, they start drying out. It might heat up if the water goes away, or it might cool down if the water goes away and the water was warmer than the air temperature. There's also a lack of food there. Marine organisms are set to feed and forage when the water is there, particularly the filter feeders that capture small particles and small organisms out of the water. They can't feed when the water is down. So at the top of the intertidal, these harsh physical conditions really set the pace of life. But at the lower edge of the intertidal, this is an area that is exposed sometimes. It may not be exposed for very long. Most of the time, that area is under normal water conditions. Well, here, the stresses tend to be more biological. They tend to be dominated by interactions among species because here it's easier to live. All those harsh physical features are not quite so apparent. There's more species that are living there. They might be growing faster. There's more competition for space. There's more predation. There's more grazers. And so the lower part of the intertidal is, generally speaking, characterized by a lot of intense species interactions. The upper part of the intertidal characterized by harsh physical conditions. All of these things affect the organisms there. They affect them in a gradient going from the bottom to the top of the intertidal. This is a great picture sort of showing part of what is happening in this part of the intertidal. These are periwinkle snails that are hanging on to Spartina grass marsh grasses on the east coast of the United States. Why are they out of water? These are marine snails. What are they doing on these marsh grass blades? Well, the water's here. It basically, tide is actually coming up, and these snails crawl up the blades of the grass to get out of the water. Why? Why are they doing that when they're marine creatures? Well, the main reason is that the water is full of predators, particularly these mud crabs and even some fish. And so at high tide, the safest place for these snails to be is actually out of the water on the grass. Now, when the tide recedes, they'll go back down and then begin foraging around the shallow water because the predators have left by then. And this tidal change in behavior is, in fact, the way this particular species responds to the predators down below. they flee when they're there, but they don't spend all their time up on the marsh grasses themselves because of the harsh conditions up there. So these species take this gradient and then they move in order to change their position and take advantage of the different parts of that gradient. Well, other species can't really move. This is a picture of California mussels, Middleus californianus. And these mussels are bivalves. They are stuck to the rocks with byssal threads. And once they're in place, they can't move very much, maybe a foot or two in the whole course of their lives. And so wherever they sit is where they have to be able to live and grow. Now, these are filter feeders. They're pumping water all the time that there's water around and pulling mostly phytoplankton out of the water in order to live and grow. Now, they are experiencing the harsh conditions at the top of the intertidal, particularly desiccation and heat. But at the lower end of the intertidal, they also are experiencing the harsh conditions there. They're a very good competitor for space, so they don't have to worry too much about that. What they do have to worry about are predators. And in this case, their major predators are starfish. A starfish like Piesaster here lives in the lower part of the intertidal and the very shallow subtidal. They are an active predator on all sessile marine invertebrates that live on the shore, but particularly the California mussels. And so the starfish creep up the intertidal when the tide comes up. They grab mussels, pull them out of the mussel beds where they were attached, and then begin to digest them, often by going back down the intertidal to do that. So the lower edge of the intertidal is a zone for these mussels that has access to the starfish. The upper edge is dominated by heat and desiccation and lack of food. And so that means that the mussels actually can only thrive in a band between where the starfish predation goes on and where the heat and desiccation is too high. That creates what's called zonation. That is the organization of species along intertidal gradients in bands that define a distance above the low tide and below the high tide. You can see some of that zonation here. The top here is the set of zonation that is defined by the California mussels. That's the sort of dark part here made up of mussels. And you can see sort of an abrupt change, an abrupt cessation, an abrupt barrier where there's no mussels below one particular point, and mostly it looks like it's bare rock, but it's actually covered by coral and algae and all kinds of other things. Well, this is the zone where the starfish can come up out from here up to that point, grab a mussel, and come back down. And so that lower zone is defined by predation. You also see an upper zone here of some of the marine algae that are living on this shore, and that's probably set by the ability of these species to survive desiccation and heat when the tide goes out. And how organisms respond to these gradients define the zonation of the intertidal. This diagram was one of the first ones to lay that out from the land to the sea with the shift in species from the upper intertidal down to the mid and lower intertidal. You often see at the upper intertidal just algae and some snails. You pick up a barnacle zone, then the mussels, then more algae and different kinds of organisms, and then down further, the fleshy brown algae, the laminarians and kelp define the very lowest part of the intertidal in this particular in this particular diagram. This happens all over the world in different places, and organisms that want to inhabit these different zones have to have specific kinds of adaptations to live there. What we're going to do next is we're going to look at one marine organism that is living way up in the upper part of the intertidal and the adaptations that it uses to do that. And we're going to then talk about a land plant that is living down in the ocean part, the seawater, the lower part of the intertidal, and the adaptations that they have to have. What we're going to talk about next is a set of organisms that live high in the intertidal, even though they're really adapted to live in more ocean settings. And my favorite example of that is actually my favorite sea urchin, this one, the shingle urchin called Colobus centrotus. doesn't look like a normal sea urchin. This is what a normal sea urchin looks like, with pointy spines all over it. They're basically anti-predator devices. These animals all live below sea level. They're rarely in the intertidal at all. But Colobus centrotus lives spectacularly in upper intertidal settings all over the tropical Pacific. It gloms onto rocks, not below sea level, but generally above sea level, and in places like this where wave action on basaltic shorelines generates a lot of big wide intertidals, places even above the low tide mark, that are covered in spray and waves and are generally wet. So this animal is actually adapted to living not really in the ocean at all, but in the upper intertidal above there. Well, there's kind of two adaptations that you might think about that this sort of animal has in order to live and way up in the intertidal. Now, if it lived way up in the intertidal in the tropical Pacific without any waves, then they would just bake. As the tide went out, the sun would come out, the heat would kill them. So they could only really live in upper parts of the intertidal when waves are constantly rolling over, splashing them, covering them with water temporarily, and coming back. So to live up there, they have to be able to be adapted to a lot of water motion to high wave energies. These are two cross sections, or two drawings from the side of a shingle urchin, Colobus centrotus, and a regular sea urchin. And you can see that one of the adaptations that Colobus centrotus seems to have to living in high wave energy is its streamlined shape. Each of these plates here are not actually plates, they're spines. They're just spines that have been essentially flattened out. They don't get long and pointy, they grow up into like toadstools almost, and they form this plate shell across the sea urchin. There's another shell under that, which is the real shell of the animal. This is just the spine plates around it. So that's one way that these animals are adapted to live in the high intertidal by being streamlined. This just shows a little bit of a closer view of those plates. And two things that I want to point out is that the plates are fit pretty closely together, but there's gaps all the way between. The second adaptation, though, that they have to living in high wave energy is actually on the flip side, and that's the tube feet. That's a set of feet underneath the animal in a ring around this, which is its mouth. And these tube feet are essentially suckers at the end of a tube that's full of fluid, and the animal can put a vacuum on that fluid and then essentially attach the suckers of its 2 feet onto the rock surfaces that it's on. Well, all echinoderms have those tube feet. Sea urchins use them particularly to hang on and move around, but so do starfish, so do sea cucumbers. And the 2 feet of Colobus centrotus are remarkable in a couple of ways. One is that they are largely on the bottom here, and that they're much stiffer and tougher than other sea urchin tube feet. To get a little closer look at how 2 feet are fundamental to the way these urchins live their lives, let's delve into a sea urchin a little bit. The sea urchin is covered by a set of calcareous plates that make up something called a test. And then the spines sit on tubercles that are on the test. But also through the plates on the test is a whole series of small pores. Through those pores come the tube feet that are then connected inside the animal to a whole hydra system, a whole set of pipes and hoses, if you will, that are able to be pressurized by the animal. And it's the combination of the pressure inside those tube feet, inside of those hoses, and the muscles in the columns of those tube feet that allow the tube feet to bend, to lengthen, to basically put the sucker onto some surface, hold onto it, and then pull the whole animal forward. So all echinoderms use these tube feet. Sea urchins use them constantly to move around and to attach themselves to the rock. Starfish also use them. In fact, Piesaster uses its really strong tube feet to grab onto the shell of the mussels and pull them apart to open them. Um, and for the Colobus introtus sea urchins, their strong tube feet are mostly concentrated down here on the oral side. The mouth is here, so this is called the oral side, and it's used to hold them on to the rock. But the tube feet also play another role for sea urchins. They are a really important part of the oxygen exchange system for sea urchins because sea urchins don't have any gills. They have nothing like the gills that crabs have, or fish, or even most mollusks. There's nothing frilly that the sea urchin passes water across to get oxygen. Instead, the tube feet are a very good way of oxygen diffusing into the body. Oxygen goes in from the water through the tube feet into this system and then diffuses through the rest of the animal. That's the way that this sometimes big animals get oxygen inside the body. Well, it's a pretty good system if you have lots of tube feet. And this is a shot of the very narrow tube feet of a purple sea urchin. You can see the little suckers at the end. You can see that there's lots of them, that they are often very highly extended. And so there's a lot of surface area on these tube feet for oxygen to diffuse in, and also lots of ways for all these tube feet to grab hold of something and pull the urchin across. But for Colobus introtus, its tube feet down at the bottom of the animal and being pretty stout and not very long means that their oxygen diffusing capacity is relatively low. In fact, the Colobus introtus does have an oxygen diffusion surface, but unlike the other urchins, it's actually on the surface of the animal, and it's in between and underneath all of those plates that are modified spines. So it's using actually a modified set of tissues as an oxygen transporting, as an oxygen diffusing system. Well, problem with that is that it's not a very big surface area for diffusion of oxygen for animals that can be several inches across. And although there's lots of oxygen in ocean water, it's harder to get it out of the water than it is to get the equivalent amount of oxygen out of air, mostly because you have to move water across the surface to continue to get oxygen out of it, whereas it's easier to get oxygen diffusing out of the air. So paradoxically, the whole system that the Colobus introtus, the single urchin, uses to hold on to the rock means that it has a much lower amount of lung capacity, if you will, or gill capacity. And the gills are so limited that they don't work well in water. They work well enough in air to keep the animal alive and thriving, and they work well when they're wet. But if they're dry, or if the animal is actually underwater all the time, then it doesn't work well to exchange oxygen. In fact, Colobus introtus is so dependent upon access to atmospheric air in order to get oxygen that if you take a Colobus introtus and you throw it in the water, it'll climb right back out. And if you put it in the water again and you keep it from climbing out, clamp down or just put it in a closed container with no air pocket, it can't get out of the water. It can't get enough oxygen. And these sea urchins, these marine sea creatures, will actually drown. I started off talking about the plates themselves and the streamlining. And then we talked about these really thick tube feet that hold them on. And they both can be seen as a way of holding on the animal and keeping the waves from hitting it. But the plates on the spines might be doing something else. It may be that they're flat, not to reduce hydrodynamic drag from the waves, but maybe they're flat in order to keep the tissue underneath them sheltered and keep that tissue wet in order to exchange oxygen. So here's a question to pose for everyone on the other side of the screen here. How would you tell whether or not the plates of the Colobus centrotus shingle urchin were an adaptation to lower the drag from the waves, or whether or not they were really there to protect the tissue underneath it and keep it dry? What could you think of to do to test whether or not the tube feet were plenty for the animal to hang on in high wave energies, or whether they really needed that streamlining as well? In part 3 of this lecture on the shallowest parts of the ocean, we're going to talk about a set of organisms, mangrove trees, that have colonized and dominated the land-sea margin. And usually land plants have a very difficult time dealing with the salt water, the salt content of salt water. And an exception are the mangroves, and that exception has opened up a huge ecological niche for them that really isn't filled by almost anything else. So mangroves live at the land-sea interface. They in fact define the land-sea interface in a lot of places that they exist. They span the range from the low intertidal all the way to the high intertidal. Above them is a land habitat. Below them is an ocean habitat. And in between, they have to deal with the harsh physical environment of the intertidal, like we discussed in other areas. Well, they also have two kinds of phases of their lives. Above the water, the branches and the leaves of a typical tree, they grow in thickets, but they look like a regular tree. But below water, they have a whole set of branching rootlets that dive into the sediment and hold on to the sediment to allow them to persist in the face of storms, and also be able to grow out laterally. Well, that sediment tends to be relatively fine-grained, partly because that's where they tend to grow, but also partly because once they start growing, they capture sediment from the surrounding water and then build sets of fine-grained sediment around them. By being very thick growth on coastal margins, they can protect those margins from storms that come in from the ocean side. They also create a lot of habitat because their roots themselves create habitat structure in places that otherwise would just be sand or soft sediment. The other thing that mangroves have to deal with is salt. There's salt all around them in the ocean environment, and most land plants don't deal well with salt. In fact, their tissues, their cells, I mean, they have some salt in them, but just like our cells, the salt content is a lot lower than seawater. So mangroves then deal with salt in two very different kind of ways. Exemplified by white mangroves and black mangroves. White mangroves allow the salt in through the roots. It goes all through their tissues and branches and leaves, but they essentially excrete the salt from their leaves as salt crystals, thereby getting it out of their system. So this is a picture of a white mangrove leaf with these little white dots are salt crystals underneath it, and this blow up there shows just some of those crystals as they're coming out of small pores in those leaves. In fact, that dusting of salt is so common and so ubiquitous on these that's what's given them their name, white mangroves, because of the white dust that's sitting on their leaves. Well, by contrast, black mangroves let the salt come in around the roots, but they exclude it from their tissues. They have filters that allow water to come in because the plants need water, but it keeps the salt out. The filters are good enough to keep 99% of the salt from bridging the gap between the outside and the inside of the roots. And as a consequence, although the black mangroves are sitting fully immersed in salt water, their tissues just have the normal amount of salt in them that any land plant would have. So all of these adaptations allow mangroves to thrive in coastal environments. They spread up and down coasts, and they provide a huge amount of both protection and nursery habitat for other species. This just is a shot of underneath some of the mangrove roots. You can see in these kinds of shots that the mangrove roots themselves are a substrate for other organisms to live in. There's large numbers of algae and hydroids and sponges and bivalves living in these, and then in and among them are whole sets of species of fish. Because mangrove roots, the extensive sets of them in very shallow water around the tropics, are an important nursery habitat for a large number of fish. In fact, those nursery habitats are so important that the small juvenile fish that normally live out on the reef or even in the pelagic zone often spend the earlier part of their lives here sheltered in the mangrove roots. So they play a huge role in coral reefs, even though they are mangrove roots. This just shows some of the ways that different kinds of fish use different types of habitats, whether it's coral reefs or seagrasses or mangroves. And these are different types of fish, of reef fish, juveniles and adults. And what you can see is that almost all of them use mangrove habitats at some point in their life, particularly in the juvenile phases and in some cases as a way to shelter until they get big enough to live out on the reef themselves. So mangroves and coral reefs, although they look like they're very different kinds of habitats in the tropics, actually are connected by their connection with different life stages, particularly of these different types of fish. The other role that they play in a major way in coastal environments is protection from storms. And that's become more and more obvious as sea levels are going up a little bit, storm intensities are increasing, and storm lengths are increasing. And the devastation of coastal habitats has been something that we've seen from tsunamis and hurricanes all over the world. More and more evidence has shown that villages, communities that are sheltered behind mangroves actually have much more protection from those storms than other communities do. A set of studies over the last 10 or 15 years shows how mangroves in front of communities protect them from storm damage behind. This particular study, places where there is dense tree, or high tree density in front of there's storm damage behind of it, there's a lot less. And in fact, when you begin to look at the reduction in casualties, the protection of shoreline value by mangroves, then it becomes more and more obvious that mangroves themselves provide not just an ecological benefit because of their connection to the fish population and to reduce flooding, but also protection of the shorelines themselves and protection of the human communities that live nearby them. More and more as human communities grow in coastal areas, the intersection between the land and the sea becomes one of intense human commerce. And learning how to protect the parts of that land-sea interface, particularly mangroves, seagrass beds, marshes that protect the shore, is a hugely important part of preparing for future climate change.